Hi everyone from New Zealand on the 12th of January 2018. Today I'm going to talk about the myth that the best care provider is a midwife, and tomorrow I'm going to talk about the myth that the best care provider is an obstetrician or doctor. Why not? This is all part of the mummy wars, and this is where women with a capital W have become insane since I gave birth in the 1970s. It's been that quick. Now, why do I think I have anything to say to anybody at 73 when I'm not having children? Well, the reality is all of us, if we live this long, live through different trends. And that trend doesn't start at our birth, and it doesn't start at the first birth that we have. So I've, in fact, lived through 3 different births, trends, or evidence-based practice trends. And we're now at the end of the 3rd one, which, like the other 2, didn't quite suit. How didn't it suit? So the first one was follow your doctor's orders, and at least in the United States, everybody went to the hospital and had an obstetrician. In New Zealand, where I live, they had maternity hospitals that were run by nurse midwives, and there were home births in the UK and Holland and other developed countries, and certainly in third world countries. Women had babies at home, and their mother or their auntie or a traditional birth attendant attended them. So humanity's had a variety of things. But after the Second World War, when I was born, the hospital system and maternity care became very important, and that was to follow the doctor's orders. Women were knocked out. My mother was given scopolamine. Cesareans were very rare. Women labored for days because cesareans were so dangerous and such a serious operation. So when I gave birth in 1970, there were only 3% cesarean rate compared to what there is now, which is 30%. And a lot of that, honestly, is due to the fact that women didn't want to have a classical incision. They wanted to have a low-lying incision so that their scar wouldn't show when they wore bikinis in the late 1970s. There are other reasons as well. Doctors wanted to make it safer because they knew that women who had long, hard births, also their baby was at greater risk, and they were at greater risk. So when I gave birth in 1970, there was a skills-based approach or trend to childbirth based on Grantley, Dick Reed, Lamaze, and the Bradley method. But that system didn't fulfill its goals, which was for women who use skills to have a less medical birth because there was evidence-based or standards of practice, to have a pain-free labor, which most women didn't have, and to have what was called a natural birth, which was still undefined. But it left out everybody else, and that was a fatal flaw, but we can't blame them because it was the first time anybody said, oh, you can have skills. So then in the late 1970s, early 80s, the present trend, the choice-based trend, if skills didn't work to achieve natural birth, then women should choose the pros and cons of medical care because birth was then defined as, pregnancy and birth were defined as, quote, normal life events that rarely require medical care. So women shouldn't have imposed on them, which is accurate, a standard of care. However, you really want to have assessments, monitoring, and procedures because pregnancy and childbirth are so very infrequent that we do ritualize them. They are culturally ritualized. In modern countries, they're ritualized into medical care. If you said to the general population in modern countries, every other aspect of your life is going to have or be influenced by medical care, if you need it or want it or your doctors feel you need it, but birth and pregnancy, nope, we're going to just let it go back to the way it was when women lived without medical care, people wouldn't stand for it because it's so infrequent that people really want to safeguard the mother's health and well-being. So in all of this melee of things, the midwifery debate occurred. In the United States, midwives had been outlawed as of the 1950s, and little by little the discussion was, how do we bring them back in the 50 states that had all their different legalization issues? So if you want to know about the states, research it. I know about the states, it's complex. New Zealand in the 1990s, the nurse midwives who wanted to see midwifery be an autonomous practice, then were able to achieve that, and that's what we have in New Zealand now. We have direct entry midwives that see themselves as non-medical. Does that mean they don't do the standard assessments, monitoring procedures? Of course they do. So are they medical or are they not medical? Philosophically, they're not medical, but they certainly are medical within the system. Or else you have to ask, why does the medical system even value them if they see themselves as non-medical? So it becomes very complex, and this is why the myths around childbirth are so important to discuss. And as I said, at some point I'm going to talk about the truths about childbirth, because that's simple. But I'm going to try to do it in relationship to all of these other myths to see how they overlay. So if you have a choice of being with a midwife, either a lay midwife who has no formal training, a nurse midwife who has an extension of her nursing profession, or a direct entry midwife who is formally trained but skips the nursing part, great, terrific, wonderful. If you don't have access, then you either see an obstetrician or a general practitioner, or the fact is that you're home alone without a professional birth provider. It's the way it is, okay? So is a midwife safer? Well, a lot of midwives do offer something that obstetricians don't offer, but GPs do offer. They offer what's called continuity of care. So your GP can see you in pregnancy, they can be at your birth, and they will see you after birth. The difference between a midwife and a GP is that the midwife stops seeing you around 6 weeks after the birth, whereas your GP continues to see you throughout your children and your family's life. So in fact, a GP is more continuity of care than a midwife is. So the question is, are midwives, which is how the midwifery profession has been promoted since the 1970s, but is not promoted when I've lived and worked in traditional communities with nothing to do with birth at all. I go because I want to make fires without matches, or I want to know how humans lived without refrigeration or electricity. But you talk to people, babies are born, women are pregnant. They either have access to the hospital or they don't have access to the hospital. So you find out things. So you find out that very few cultures have a defined profession called midwifery. However, they do have defined professions of people who are specialists in some things. So if you go into a traditional community, you'll know that there are people who are fishermen, or there are people that are herders, or there are people who make pottery, or there are people who do wood carvings. But not every culture has a profession of midwifery, because there is no cultures, except for modern cultures, where the midwives in traditional communities are attending women they don't know. So that's really important to understand. When you hire a midwife in a developed country, they don't know you. They're going to try to get to know you. And there's one thing that you as a birthing woman needs to fully understand. When you ask a woman who works as a midwife to be continuity of care, and you have an expectation that they are there for you whenever you need them, you are taking time away from their family, their needs, her life. And if she is in practice where she has to make a living from her practice, and she may have to attend 20 to 80 births or more a year, you are consuming a large part of her life. So when we as birthing pregnant women think about midwifery care, and we are told that they are there for us and they tell us that, we often take advantage of that. And we see it in New Zealand, where midwives set themselves up as separate from nurses because nurses had shift work of 8 hours. So midwifery said, when they wanted to become legalized, we'll give women 24/7 care. And how bizarre is that from a profession that specifically defines pregnancy and birth as being normal life events which rarely require medical care. But of course, because they don't see themselves as medical, then they can say, well, we're not medical. However, if it's a normal life event, why are they giving women 24/7 care? And what happens when they give them 24/7 care is that they exhaust the women who dedicate themselves to be midwives. So, if you have a midwife, it's your responsibility to make certain you understand she has a life. And this is one of the reasons when Birthing Better skills developed in the early 70s, there were people that did have midwives, and there were a lot of lay midwives. And what we found out is that we had a tendency to say, we'll rely on the midwife. And yet at the same time, people were saying, you're not supposed to love your obstetrician, but women then were in love with their midwife. And when I came to New Zealand, they actually had an article that said, is midwifery a profession or a friendship? So that's thinking about it. So when you hire a midwife, if you have the privilege to do that, you have to take more responsibility. And I'm going to say this right out front. That woman or man who is working with you is not something that as soon as she was born, she has some sort of knowledge about childbirth. She may have a passion for pregnancy and childbirth. She may love to be around birth. And by and large, most midwives around the world love being around simple births, straightforward births. They don't like complicated births. And very, very few midwives will pass over what they have either as standards of care, guidelines to practice that are defined by their profession, or they won't take the risk of being at births where it becomes more complex because they often don't have the training. It's as simple as that. So if we as women don't take more responsibility to help the midwifery profession to stay strong and stable and able to give service to us in continuity of care, then we are shooting ourselves in the foot, and we're also making it more difficult for the future of women who want to have a midwife and for midwives who work in practice. And when Birthing Better Families developed the skills, this was something we were conscious of. In fact, we were conscious of it in all of our births. We developed skills so that we could cope and manage in birth. First, it was about labors. Then it was about unplanned cesareans. What do we do if we make a change? What about those who wanted to have or needed to have or were pressured to have non-laboring cesareans? Our baby's birth was important to us. We chose to have skills to birth our baby. Then we developed skills to prepare our body to birth our baby, no matter how the birth was going to unfold. And we committed to using those skills because this was our baby's birth, not because of the place or because of the person or because what did or didn't happen to us. So what we noticed as individuals when we went into hospitals skilled, that the staff, the obstetrical nurses in the United States, the nurse midwives, the lay midwives, or when we went into the hospital, lay midwives weren't there. When we went into the hospital with skills, we relaxed the staff because we behaved in a way that was focused and coping. And they saw so few of that since the skills-based approach was replaced with the choice-based approach. Over the years, they saw fewer and fewer skilled women and fewer skilled dads because they were writing birth plans and trying to support women's choices. When we were at home, we had to struggle with this because there is such a message that midwives somehow are given that they sort of know how to birth. We hear it all the time. Women don't need to have internals done. Midwives can hear when women are pushing. This is a myth because there are too many women who push on an undilated cervix and push for hours. If your second stage lasts, there is no progression in your second stage within an hour, there is some tension or compression or bending of the space in your body. Even if you have a tight vagina, your baby should be coming down through it. within an hour. That doesn't mean out, but it should be out within an hour and a half or 2 hours. And if it lingers longer, there's either tension inside, a compression of the space, or a bending of the angle the baby needs. And this is what families taught me. We had to learn this. So what we realized was that if we had midwives, we tended to use our skills when the midwife hadn't arrived. And then as soon as the midwife arrived, we handed over our capability to a person we felt had some sort of magic something and would then tell us or know what to do. At the same time, people like Carolyn Flint and Michelle O'Donnell were advocating that midwives sit in a corner and knit or read a book. Michelle O'Donnell put women in the room by themselves, and he sat outside and listened. Carolyn Flint believed that you sit in a corner and knit and let a woman discover birth by herself. So there was this conflict between women who had midwives who gave over, well, what do we do? And midwives who were going, well, you discover birth. When we lacked skills, we struggled with that. We didn't understand that was sort of like the foundation of the relationship. They'll give us continuity of care and spend a lot of time with us in pregnancy, but at the birth, they back off us. They don't become the birth coach, which we expect them to be. And because they often think birth is normal and think that women know how to birth, midwives answered lots of questions. But when you ask women and men who go to midwives, did your midwife teach you how to birth? The answer is no. Sometimes they had a pelvis and showed you how the baby came down or gave you information. And so families thought that if midwives didn't teach them to birth, there wasn't anything they needed to know. And if they didn't coach them at the birth, they didn't know what to do if they didn't have skills. So as Birthing Better Families, we took the responsibility to be skilled going in the hospital, and we wowed our obstetrician and the staff there, absolutely wowed them. They just said, can't we have more of you? Yes, you can. We can grow a skilled birthing population globally, worldwide, for all births. But it takes you to help us do that. We can't do this on our own. My God, I'm 73. I've spent 45 years saying the same thing over and over again and being shouted down by the trends in childbirth. So I'm at my last leg, so to speak, and I'm reaching out via eCam as a Mac tool for live Facebook. So when we had home births with midwives, we became very responsible to make certain that we really were skilled and we had a good, effective birth. And the midwives appreciated it. They were sick of going to home births that were long and tiring. They really got more nervous as the birth lingered on. People didn't know whether to transport or to not transport. So it's really important that if the best care provider for you, and you have the choice as a midwife, that you become highly skilled. And let me tell you another thing, because, I'm talking to you and I can actually say it. If you have high risks and are going to have a home birth, which many of the Birthing Better families had, very multiple high risks, and they would never go to the hospital. I worked with a lot of people who were very religious who were never, ever going to step foot in the hospital. They prayed. Look at me. I'm not a religious person in that manner, but I worked with a lot of them. And I worked with people who were very religious who loved hospitals. So it wasn't that religious people didn't like hospitals. It's some religions won't go to the hospital for any reason at all. But they still have medical high risks, and they were defined. Those people were even more committed to being responsible. And this is why the Birthing Better skills are so important. They took a evolutionary step from Grantley Dick Reed, Lamaze, and Bradley. One is it's for all births. It's how to prepare your body for birth. And it's about how to discover what are the issues that you need to work with to make certain that your birth does not traumatize you or your baby. In other words, we can reduce or prevent issues from becoming problems by being skilled. The faster we can get our baby out of our body, the safer our baby is. So it's really important that you understand that if you have a midwife, Your responsibility is to protect her as a person, to make certain you don't gobble up her time and energy, and that you protect the ability for the future generation to have dedicated midwives because you took responsibility to become skilled in your birth. That's important. Your midwife loves her profession. We are exhausting them. To tell you the truth, in New Zealand, where everybody has a continuity of care midwife, they're leaving in droves. And they're more likely to go in as staff in the hospitals and the district health boards because they don't want to be tired. They leave the profession within 7 years. This is not longevity. It takes 7 years to really become skilled at being a midwife. So it's important for you to understand that midwives are great, wonderful if you have one, and boy, you need to take the responsibility to become highly skilled to protect the profession and to protect the one that you have chosen. And you need to explain to her how you are going to do that. Full stop. So tomorrow we're going to talk about the myth of the best care provider being the obstetrician. I've gone over my 20 minutes, right? So see you tomorrow. Please recommend the Birthing Better Skills. It's a home study course. Families created it for families. It is the teacher. You don't need a professional to teach it to you, and you don't need a professional to do it on you either. So learn the skills, particularly if you're going to have a midwife be your care provider. Bye-bye.